launchers were altered, I guess. One was supposed to be used for a speaker on some sort of stereo system. I don't know what the other one was for, but they were given as gifts by a Ukrainian chief of police to the Polish chief of police with the hope of cultivating closer ties and cooperation. Somewhere along the line, the Ukrainians seem to think it happened after they sent it off to him, and that may well be true. I have no idea. A live grenade was found in this thing, and it accidentally or purposely exploded. We don't know, but it's a very hard to imagine how something like this could have crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland without being detected. I'm sure the Polish chief of police wasn't hiding anything.
How would this have been delivered? Not through the mail.
Well, I don't know. The sad part here is that you're well aware, as many of us are, that there's this long history of antagonism between the Poles and the Ukrainians. So this opens up that whole ugly chapter for discussion. Was this intentional, or was this in fact an accident? Nobody is able to answer it, except that right now the facts are what I sent to you on email, and that's all we know.
What were the injuries to the Polish commander? Do we know?
Apparently none. He had maybe modest scratches or something, but no serious injuries of any kind were reported.
Okay. Do we still have a president of Poland beating the drum and acting as if his troops are going to get engaged? I think we do. Do we not?
Yes. Well, in the op-ed that I just finished that the American Conservative will have out tomorrow, I lead with the remarks of the Deputy Polish Minister of Defense, who is warning an audience on the 29th of November that this war is growing in intensity and Poland is likely to be involved in it, and hints at potential mobilization and a number of other things down the line. Now, since then, we've also had a source tell us that the Polish government is now looking at 200,000 troops that could be mobilized next year. All of this is disconcerting because, remember, inside the NATO alliance, Poland is really alone in its enthusiasm for aggressive war against Russia. Nobody else, with the possible exception of the Romanians, is interested.
Well, your piece is a scary one, Colonel. I mean, you start by summarizing the interview. We talked about this before, but we'll touch on it again. That General Zaluzhny had with The Economist magazine, and when he asks for 300 new tanks and 600 to 700 new infantry fighting vehicles and 500 new howitzers, you conclude he's not asking for assistance, he's asking for a new army, and he must know that this is not possible.
Well, one would think so, and I think they were trying to set the stage for a meeting with the United States in which they would get more other types of assistance, potentially convince us and maybe others in this so-called coalition of the willing to intervene and help them in some way. That's why I find it extremely disturbing, because President Biden has said from the beginning that we were not going to directly engage the Russians in a military confrontation. Yet we seem to be moving closer to that outcome. And the Poles, of course, I think would actually welcome that, which is very dangerous. This is the problem when you ally yourself with a relatively small state. The small state has a permanent interest in leveraging your power for their benefit.
Right. You point out that Ukraine hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity, and Ukraine with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers. How many healthy soldiers do they have remaining? Do you know?
The last word that I had was they had 194,000 quote unquote effectives. And in the article, Zaluzhny mentions that he's got 200,000 combat ready troops, people that can fight. He has another 500,000 people in uniform, but they're not necessarily soldiers. They may be police, paramilitary, other kinds of functionaries, but they're not fit for frontline duty. And I think that's a huge admission, because it also tells you something about the enormous number of casualties that the Ukrainians have been taking.
Why is General Zaluzhny saying all this in public? Is there some purpose or goal to this.
Yeah, I think, again, he and President Zelensky know what I know and know what anybody knows who looks carefully at the assembling Russian force and its enormous firepower, standoff attack and direct firepower. And he's being honest. He's saying, well, their attacks could be stronger than we think, and we could be weaker than we thought later on in the article. In other words, it's a backhanded way of saying, look, this is very dangerous. We probably are not going to succeed against this kind of force. We've asked you for more. What are you going to do? In other words, the ball is in your court, Washington. And after all, we urged them to fight from the beginning. We've never come back and said, well, there's a point at which it makes no sense to fight on.
Would it be fair to characterize General Zaluzhny as the realist and President Zelensky as sort of has pipe dreams? And would it be fair to say that the Russians have far more respect for the general than they do for the president?
Well, first of all, I have no idea, but I suspect that Zaluzhny, who's been on the phone before with his counterpart in Moscow, has at least a rapport with the Russians. What that is and how well that goes, I can't evaluate, but they have talked. And I think Zaluzhny is being realistic and as open as he can. And Zelensky is permanently cheerleader for the war in perpetuity and has sold himself as Washington's man on the ground to lead the charge against Moscow. I don't think he can back down from that. He's made so many sweeping statements that are so ridiculous that he can't retreat.
Is it conceivable that General Zaluzhny would work out some peace agreement with the Russians in order to save hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives, no matter what President Zelensky thinks about, almost sort of pushing him out of the way? He's got the pipeline to Moscow. Nobody in Moscow will say a word to President Zelensky.
You know, Judge, we're now in the realm that I would comfortably call the Twilight Zone.
All right.
Who knows? I mean, we could sit here and speculate about that, but I think there are lots of people that are willing to pull out their weapons and shoot people down right now inside Kiev in the government who might go that route. I think that they're stuck. They're going to fight. And perhaps in the midst of this fighting, there will be a call for some sort of ceasefire. And again, the problem is you're dealing now with a Russian government that has given up on the West.
Let's move from the East all the way to the West. Does General Zaluzhny have respect at the Pentagon? Does he have the ear of General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, or of Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin, somebody who can get to the president on the phone in a few minutes?
I'm sure that he probably has a line to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and potentially the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And remember, you know, we've been down this road before with Milley. He leaked his rejected advice to the president to the New York Times when he said Ukrainians have done about as much as they can and they should negotiate. And that was rejected. And he was sent back out to recant and effectively sing the tune of inevitable Ukrainian victory. So at this point in time, even if he has a direct line, the man in charge is sitting in the White House. And I'm sure that no one in this administration at this stage wants to admit that they made a terrible mistake and put Ukraine's very existence at risk.
Your greatest fear, and stop me if I don't have this right, is that the man in the White House will pull an LBJ. And when his generals, when Westmoreland said to LBJ, we're going to lose unless we don't have another 125,000 troops, LBJ said, you got them. I don't know that Zaluzhny would say that to Biden, but what's to prevent Biden from saying, I'm using your language, Colonel, you wrote this, it's brilliant. By the way, for those listening to us, it's called Downfall in Kyiv and Washington, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and it'll be available tomorrow at the American Conservative at their website. Colonel, your fear is that Joe Biden wants to lead a coalition of the willing, which is to be about 2 or 3 NATO countries.
Yes, I think that the people in Washington, and when I say people, I'm talking about virtually everybody inside the Beltway, has all drunk heavily from the Kool-Aid that says Russia is weak, Russia is incompetent, the soldiers are no good, the army is weak, we can prevail. We have to stay the course with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians can still outfight them. And if we need to go in to bolster the Ukrainians and try to establish, under the guise of a no-fly zone on the ground, some sort of secure area in western Ukraine, down near the Polish border, in order to provide a safe haven for retreating Ukrainian forces or refugees or something else, we should do that, because we can still dominate the Russians if we need to. And that was, see, LBJ knew that he had enormous leverage with the United States Navy and Air Force, not just our ground forces over North Vietnam. We have no such leverage over the Russians. This is a pure continental land combat, and they hold all the trump cards. And we have very few forces, and we're depending very heavily, if we go in there, on the Poles. And while the Poles are very brave, courageous soldiers, that's an irrational act on the part of an American.
I mean, what coalition would there be? Who besides Poland and Romania would be in Joe Biden's army, and America, of course?
Well, I'm sure you'd have some British Special Operations Forces. Beyond that, who knows? I mean, the rest of NATO really doesn't have much to send. I mean, the force that was described in the interview that Zaluzhny asked for is larger than any of the armies in Europe. Mm. So what are they going to send? And the answer is, I don't think they have much to send at all. And now they've already exhausted most of their supplies of ammunition and weapons. They've sent most of that excess that's either now in Russian hands, and some of it is still with the Ukrainians. But the Russians have captured a lot of equipment, destroyed a lot of equipment.
One of our regular guests is an American named Matthew Van Dyke. Matt is the head of Sons of Liberty International, which he describes as all ex-military. These guys are young. They're all like in their late 20s, early 30s, who believe in the Ukrainian cause, who wear military fatigues, who are physically present on the ground. I don't know if they carry weapons. They don't shoot. They're not close to where people are shooting or being shot at. They're training Ukrainians. Matt sent out a rather startling tweet just a few minutes ago. Here it is. Ukraine must conduct a major offensive now. Ukraine has the advantage this winter in morale and logistics. Russia will recover by spring and will never be this weak again. The next 2 months are critical in this war. Don't dig in, advance. Now, I don't know if you know this fellow. He's a young man. He's on with us regularly. This is the first time I've heard him say anything like this. Russia will recover by spring. What do you think about this?
It sounds to me like some of the ideas that were hatched by Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944 for offensives in the East, when there was no capability whatsoever for offensive action in the German army. Sounds to me like his thinking behind the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army couldn't fuel itself 100 kilometers without falling apart. So I think, I'm sure the man is very sincere and believes in what he's saying, but I think he's dead wrong. And there's not a whole lot for the Russians to do between now and the end of January for them to be ready. I think they're very close to it.
I want to go back to General Zaluzhny before I ask you about President Putin in Belarus. I want to make sure I understand the numbers. General Zaluzhny has about 190,000 troops, and then he has 200,000 trained troops and reserves. So if he wants, he has about 400,000 troops. Do I have those numbers right?
Well, he actually gave, and again, I don't know that these numbers are trustworthy. Much of what comes out of Kyiv has never been trustworthy. So take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but it's Zaluzhny who has a reputation for being truthful, no?
No. None of the Ukrainians have been truthful about the conduct of this war. They've lied prolifically about everything. And he's saying they have 700,000, 200,000 in that category of fit to fight, trained combat troops, and then 500,000 of others, police, paramilitary.
Okay.
and so
Okay.
forth. Now, again, I have no idea what's going on. I do know that the Nazi enforcers are brutalizing people, forcing them into uniform, sending them to the front.
But
This
these
is a
are
very ugly war.
These are Ukrainian Nazi
Yes,
enforcers forcing young men, able-bodied or not,
yes.
into Ukrainian military uniforms.
Yeah, they're sending press gangs through Kiev and other cities at nightclubs, night spots, to see if they can find young men who may be there, and then pressing them into service. Sort of what the Royal Navy did in the 19th century and the 18th century to keep the ships filled. So that's why I say I'm sure that Matt's sincere, and I do know that if you ask Ukrainian soldiers, they do speak very confidently of their future, as though they have a chance to really win. And you heard that from German soldiers right up until March of 1945.
Oof.
So I don't think that we should take that very seriously.
I would imagine that President Zelensky's people are regressively controlling the media and what the Ukrainian troops and what their families back home hear.
Well, I'm sure they are too, but he doesn't have to work too hard to control the Western media. That's already in his camp.
Already his. Yeah, the CIA has done that for him. Yeah. All right, back to numbers available. What does President Putin have available? Is it 300,000 that are about to add to the fighting force that's there now?
No, the numbers once again that were given were misleading. He said, well, he has 200,000 fresh combat troops, probably more than that. You know, I said a few weeks ago that the numbers by January could go up to 700,000.
Russian numbers.
Russian numbers. And you just divide that roughly in half, because about half of that falls into logistics and standoff attack and fire support. The rest of it are attacking forces that go in on the ground to kill the enemy. So I think the Russians are, quite frankly, already outnumber their opponents dramatically. And they have been training very, very hard. Now, you have to add to that number probably 75,000 Belarusian troops. And Putin, of course, is up in Belarus right now.
Right. Now, what is he doing in Belarus? Belarus is another country, former Soviet satellite, but now a separate independent country.
Yes, but they are fully allied with Russia.
Okay.
And Belarus is going to provide whatever is required or necessary for the Russian forces in their country to launch attacks against Ukraine. As I said, there's 75,000 in that army, and most of that is deployed along the border with Lithuania and Poland. But they have a secure base of support in Belarus for at least 100, 150,000 troops attacking north to south.
I'll tell you what I'm afraid of the most as I listen to you and our friend Scott Ritter, and as I read the media available to me, is that the president of Poland is crazy. He's very, very anxious to begin a conflagration that historians will one day call World War III.
Well, that's again going back to the discussion earlier about a small state ultimately leveraging a large one.
Right. Will Joe Biden, who could get into Biden's head? Will pressure be put on Joe Biden, whether it's from the Pentagon or the globalists, to back Poland up?
Oh, I think that that's very much in people's minds right now, that Poland is the springboard against Russia, and that we should be prepared to use that in order to rescue Ukraine from inevitable destruction. That's why I wrote the article, because I'm afraid that we'll suddenly hear from Joe Biden on the television. Tonight, my fellow Americans, I've directed our forces to advance into Western Ukraine to provide a safe haven or something, a secure zone in Western Ukraine. And it's about peace, democracy, and freedom, all of which has got nothing to do with what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And that's what we said about Vietnam. Only this time, you're not talking about Vietnam, you're talking about Russia, a great power.
If he does that, the Congress will do nothing. The Congress will do nothing. The president of the United States can't start a war on his own. I'm familiar with the War Powers Resolution. I think it's unconstitutional, but it is the law. But this will fall right into the hands of the globalists. We know their goal: to remove President Putin from power, whether by embarrassment and humiliation or death.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that people understand the meaning of what I've said in that op-ed, that whatever is said to justify a potential intervention by us in the western part of Ukraine should be dismissed out of hand as dangerous nonsense. The opportunity to do things differently ended a long time ago. If people were serious about trying to prevent the Russians from moving into Ukraine or deterring them from going any further than a few kilometers, we had that back in February, March, and April. We could have sent vast forces over there very, very quickly. Well, of course we didn't. And Judge, we didn't do it because they're not ready. And we don't have ready forces now for a stand-up war in Eastern Europe. So this is all dangerous nonsense.
Where is General Milley on this? I mean, what General Milley leaked was a truthful analysis of the situation, and they made him do the mea culpa. So when that happens, I mean, the White House and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, they must know that Milley is a realist. They can get him to mouth their words, but when they ask for his advice, I assume he's telling them what he truly thinks we should do, which is to get the hell out.
Well, on this occasion, I think he has told them the truth behind closed doors, that we should not involve ourselves in this. It's too risky. We don't have the forces for it. We don't have the logistical infrastructure. We don't have the ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. But he's not someone who is noted throughout his career for standing up for much of anything.
Do we have 4 stars in Europe right now?
Yes, you have a 4-star at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
And who's in charge of the 40,000 American troops in Poland?
Well, I don't know. That could be the 5th Corps commander. The 5th Corps has a headquarters over there right now from Fort Hood. Potentially, I don't know what the exact command relationships are, but you've got 3 stars, you've got a 4-star, and then you have several 2-stars. Really very top heavy for a force that's only about 45,000 troops.
Were those 45,000 trained, ready, and prepared to march? God forbid, I'm even saying this, to march east?
Well, I think they're prepared to defend the Polish border. I don't think they're prepared to advance into Western Ukraine and confront an enemy like the Russians. But again, I hold the minority opinion. Remember, I told you at the beginning, you go into Washington and everybody says, oh, these Russians are terrible. Look at them. They got all this wrong and that wrong.
In Washington, you and I are concerned.
Well, it's interesting because they have not sustained those kinds of casualties in the past. For them to lose 1,000 a day in one day, it would be interesting to know what the cause is. Did they indicate at all what had caused these deaths?
No, it's one of those short, Colonel, it's one of those short summary articles. It's no more than 2 paragraphs. It's like it was written on the fly. Maybe more is to come. If something breaks during the show, we'll pick it up and let you know. You and I discussed a piece in the Financial Times based on writing by reporters who are all over Europe, that NATO's stockpiles are getting low and needing urgent replenishment. How could that be?
Oh, I think that's easily explained. First of all, even in the 1980s, when we were pouring enormous amounts of money into our military establishment, NATO was really conducting business as usual. Now, that was better than what we've seen since the early 1990s, but there was no sense of any imminent danger of war in Europe that justified massive production of equipment or munitions. Once the wall fell, so to say, you see that the German army was rapidly disbanded. The German government simply disarmed itself and fell into the hands of these combination of Greens and leftists who were convinced that that Fukuyama was right, that history had ended and there would be no further conflict.
So NATO, and you've been saying this, NATO is giving arms to Ukraine from its substance, not from its surplus, and its substance, whatever it may need for whatever purpose, the old days, the Russian bear, but whatever purpose, its substance is depleted significantly.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this reinforces another point, that the Europeans did not sign up for a war with Russia. when this whole business began, and I say business, I'm talking about going back to 2014 with the installation of the government that was essentially friendly to us, guided by people like Victoria Nuland and others from Washington. And then the subsequent massive buildup of the Ukrainian army, designed effectively for one purpose, to attack Russia, specifically not just to attack Russia, but to regain control of Crimea. So this was an unambiguously offensive force aimed at Russia. I think the Europeans looked at this and said, well, this won't really go anywhere. The Russians really don't want to fight, and the Russians are no longer armed as they once were. And what we're discovering is that they were not entirely wrong, that the Russian military was hardly prepared for a major war, which is why they ultimately went to the pause, the strategic pause, the economy of force. And they went to a war footing. They're now on a war footing. Their factories are running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They're not in any danger of running out of ammunitions or equipment or anything else. And they're turning out excellent equipment, brand new equipment in many cases. It's arriving very rapidly at the front. They now have a very large force, and it's getting larger every day. So I think the Europeans just never signed on for this. And the problem we have right now is that we grossly miscalculated on, the Russians. We don't really understand them. We didn't pay any attention to them. We're staring strategic defeat in the face.
Have our supplies been depleted, and
Absolutely.
are they in need of replenishment, the Americans, to the same extent that NATO's are?
Well, of course, you got to remember that if you look at something like the Javelin, a friend of mine at Raytheon told me that, and this was ultimately posted by Fox News in one of the articles, but a friend at Raytheon said, look, we've gone through almost 7 years of production of Javelins in Ukraine. It takes time to build these missiles, whether it's HIMARS or Raytheon's other products like NASAMS and so forth. All of these missiles are very complex, high-tech weapons. We've gone through our stockpiles very quickly, and we have no surge capacity, none. And that's something people don't understand. But the Russians have managed to very rapidly surge production. And the Europeans are very concerned about it. That's why inside NATO, behind closed doors, people are saying, this can't go on. You've got to end this, Washington. Everyone's at risk. We have nothing left. In fact, the whole tank issue is blowing up in everybody's faces because the tanks are simply not showing up. Suddenly, other European members are reluctant to commit their Leopard tanks. And if I were sitting in their shoes right now, I would feel the same way. Why would I send my armor over there? I might, in their minds, they say, well, once Ukraine is destroyed, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think they're right.
To this argument, late last week, General Christopher Cavoli, I don't know if you know him, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, an American general, was quoted as saying Ukraine's losses are, quote, out of proportion to NATO's expectations. Now, that's consistent with what you're saying, but I'm surprised to hear that from General Cavoli, unless this is the type of leak that's intended to acclimate the public to reality.
That could be. Cavoli is the Supreme Commander, Europe, and what he says is certainly going to have a huge impact in Europe. Most people in the United States won't pay any attention, but everybody in Europe will. And so in that sense, you could be right that he's signaling that this is not going to go on. We cannot sustain this. He's not going to come out and say it, but I think that's his message. Would
someone of General Cavoli's position, an American four-star, but commanding American and foreign troops to the extent that he's commanding them, you can tell me what that means, in Europe, have needed the permission of the State Department or the Defense Department or the West Wing to make a statement that profound?
Absolutely. It would have to have been vetted in the White House as well as with the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I suspect the Secretary of State.
He also used a phrase, and maybe this is military science 101, I don't know. Precision can beat mass. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I did not necessarily use that.
No, you didn't use it. General Cavoli did.
Yeah. Cavoli is not wrong. What you need, though, is the following. Wars are won and have been won certainly for the last century plus, by accurate, devastating firepower. Your ability to direct accurate, devastating firepower against the enemy at a place and time and space that makes his position hopeless. Let's put it that way. We have precision. Unfortunately for us, so do the Russians. So do the Chinese. This monopoly that we had for years on precision munitions is gone. Now what the Russians are demonstrating is that they understand that you need both. You want precision munitions, precision missiles, precision rockets, but you want huge quantities of them if you're going to win. So Cavoli is trying to sort of be on both sides of the equation. He said, well, precision can beat mass, yes, under certain circumstances. But if your opponent has precision and mass, probably not. And that's the case with Russia right now.
Wow. You and I also talked about some of the behavior of Ukrainian agents and recruiting officials. I don't know if they're military or not, lowering the conscription age to 16. Now, everywhere in the world, a 16-year-old boy is a boy, not a man, not a fully developed man, and too young for the military, but I guess not too young for Ukraine. You and I shared a video. I don't know how old this kid was, 14 or 15, was literally kidnapped right in front of his mother's eyes and shoved into a military truck. They were just walking down the street. What is this going to do for the morale of the people in Ukraine? Is it common or is it isolated? And has the conscription age in Ukraine, this is almost child abuse, been lowered to 16?
My impression is yes, it has. And there are multiple sources confirming that this is the case. And there's lots of evidence being posted by Ukrainians all the time about the true situation. There are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that are obviously, 15, 16 years of age. So there's no doubt that this is going on. But I think this is part of the larger picture. The Russians went into this economy of force, and they maximized the effectiveness of their connectivity between space-based and terrestrial-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, assets above, and gun systems, rocket systems, missile systems. They've inflicted terrible casualties. Whole year groups of Ukrainian men are dead and are gone, have been annihilated. And at the same time, you have this much smaller population from which to draw on, as I talked about previously. There aren't 37 million people in Ukraine anymore. The areas that Zelensky controls, there are perhaps 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the Netherlands. That population is mostly male, I'm told, because lots of old men, women, and children have left the country. But still, the men that are there are not all able. Some of them are at advanced age, and lots of them are children. And so they're in desperation turning to this. This regime is at the end. It really is. But it's not going to give up. It's going to fight to the bitter end, and it's going to sacrifice whatever it can to stay in power.
But when will Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, the people that presumably are making these decisions, recognize what you just said, that the regime is at the end?
I think that for all intents and purposes, that message was delivered weeks ago from the Department of Defense to the White House, and it was rejected. Period.
Well, they're rejecting reality in deference to their political needs. Well, we'll hear that in the State of the Union tonight.
Well, I'm sure you'll hear an entirely erroneous picture. I mean, someone asked me today, how did we end up like this? I said, well, we've had 40 years of Cold War, at the end of which the Soviet Union fell apart and we emerged, if not victorious, then certainly healthy and well, and we avoided global war, which was our goal for 40 years. In just 1 year, we faced defeat in Ukraine through this proxy war, but more important, we're on the threshold of a potential confrontation with Russia, something that we worked for decades to avoid. So I guess the answer to your question, Judge, is it doesn't look good. We're not going to admit failure. No one will say they were wrong.
The Russians love anniversaries. February 24th, of course, is the anniversary of the beginning of this military incursion. From your sources, Colonel, does President Putin have his hundreds of thousands of reinforcements ready to pour in to eastern Ukraine and begin marching and killing and destroying on their way west?
Yes, they're ready. That's why I thought that by now they would have already pulled the string, so to say, and have moved north. But the shaping attacks that have been going on down in southern Ukraine have essentially set the Russians up for multiple axes of advance from the south, up towards Zaporozhye, up through the Bakhmut area, and further east up along the border with Russia. I don't know which one they're going to take. Maybe they'll take them all, but that has worked. Why they have not already attacked, who knows? I mean, one thing I'm sure Sorovikin realizes and Gerasimov realizes is that their strategy of enticing the Ukrainians to attack them relentlessly has worked. Ukraine has been bled white. And they may be saying, well, there's no reason to rush. We can wait another 3 or 4 days. Let's wait for additional ammunition. Let's wait for additional whatever it might be. Remember, logistics is important. And they want to push forward ammunition, medical support, more firepower, all of those kinds of things. And it may be they want to push some more forward. But the truth is they could go right now, and there's not much to stop them from going straight north on the eastern side all the way to Kiev.
Have you seen any evidence of demoralization amongst the Ukrainian troops because of their vast casualties?
Anecdotally, you go on Telegram and you look at the things that are being posted in Ukrainian by Ukrainians, and yes, there's plenty of evidence for it. There's no question about that. Also, the hatred and hostility is growing for Zelensky, as more and more Ukrainians are blaming.
Just let me stop you. Is this hatred from the public, Ukrainian public, from the military, or both?
Well, I'm talking primarily about soldiers in the field, but that may also apply to the population. I just don't have access to that in Western Ukraine. I don't know what they think there. But soldier-wise, oh, absolutely. And they're also looking at very corrupt leadership. You know, there are comments coming in all the time. You're stuffing your pockets with cash, you and the generals, your corrupt leaders, and we're dying, by the bushel every other day. I mean, assignment to Bakhmut for the last couple of months has been essentially a death warrant, and everybody knows it.
Not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, the former foreign minister of Poland revealed that at one point the Polish government was thinking of, I don't know how they would do this physically, militarily, and legally, partitioning Ukraine and considering the western part of Ukraine, the part largely untouched by the war that includes the capital, Kyiv, as a Polish protectorate, and thereby triggering Article 5, the obligation of all of NATO to defend Poland, if that part of Ukraine, a la Polish protectorate, were attacked by Russia. I mean, this just sounds, to me, crazy. It almost sounds like the justification Hitler used to combine Austria to Germany to protect Austria, even though the only people Austria needed to be protected from was him.
Although most Austrians disagreed, and they were quite happy to join the German state. I think Hitler's a bad comparison. Okay. I think a better comparison would be somebody like Stalin, the man that murdered 16 times the number of people Hitler ever encountered. I think Poland is another state in the region with unfinished business. You've got to go all the way back to the First World War and understand the Second World War was an extension of the First, and then all of the people in the region that were formerly part of Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even the German imperial state or Prussia, all these places fell under Russian domination, Russian communist domination, and everyone was unhappy with it. Everyone hates it, and everyone felt betrayed. The Poles in particular, once they got out from under Soviet occupation and control, always envisioned a time when they would regain their former stature in Europe as a great power. So these kinds of thoughts and strategies have been around forever. The problem is, if they are seriously considering this, and they may be, I mean, it's hard for us to know, but nothing would surprise me. The Poles are romantics to the bitter end. If they think that by moving into Ukraine and claiming that they are acting in the name of NATO and Washington, that'll be the end of NATO. The Europeans will say, you've had it, you're on your own. We're not bankrolling your war to regain your empire against Russia.
Well, we already know that the president of Poland has said his goal would be to claim back Crimea. Now, that is an impossibility, and it's insanity.
Yeah, but you mean Ukrainian president, right?
No, the Polish president.
Oh, he wants to recapture Crimea?
Yes. He wants American troops and his troops and Ukrainian troops to recapture Crimea. This is an impossibility, and I think you'd agree with me. It's insanity for him to say that.
Well, he's obviously on hallucinogenics of some kind that would make him billions of dollars if he could mass produce it. But no, I don't see any evidence for that happening. And again, look at everybody else involved. And I guess you have to make exceptions for people that live in northern Norway that think that might be great, who are on the edge of the West and are totally remote from reality. You may have some of those in England. I don't know. But everybody else on the continent of Europe will walk away from that. There's no chance of that. And that's the end of NATO. People just say, wait a minute. No, we're not joining this war on Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Is there any chance, no matter what Washington does, that Ukraine can win this war?
Well, of course.
Or that Putin can lose it?
No, of course not. No. Putin isn't going to lose anything. And so, somebody said, well, Putin is weakened and adrift. I said, you mean Joe Biden? They said, no, Putin. I said, no, Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a strategy. They know what they're doing. They're methodical. They're deliberate. They're effective. We don't. We never thought through the consequences of our actions. We're all sitting around here in Washington saying, oh, what do we do now? Ukrainians are going to lose. We can't have that. We've got to ship more over to them. What do we do? See, this has been my concern from day one, that then people who are rank amateurs are saying, well, we've got to do something. Maybe we can move into Western Ukraine, just out to Lvov, and set up a safe zone. I don't think it's going to go down very well with the Russians at this point. You can't tell your opponent, you must be humiliated. Your state must be dismembered, and your government must be destroyed. Then we will kindly accept your surrender and welcome you into the brotherhood of international globalism or something. But that's effectively what we've been saying. So if you're a Russian right now, you're looking at this and saying, we're just going to keep going until there's nobody left in Ukraine that opposes us. And I'm afraid that's the path they're on. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to try to seriously arrest it.
What will it take, in your mind, for Zelensky to call up Tony Blinken and say, let's start some back-channel communications with the Russian foreign minister, because this can't go on much longer? Or is he not the type of rational person to do that? Or is Blinken not the type of person to accept that?
I think Blinken and the president would have to assure Zelensky that he and his inner circle will be flown immediately to Miami or Malibu or somewhere, and ensconced in wealthy homes and surroundings, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives, in which case he might do that. But otherwise, forget it.
All right. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Colonel, where on the planet is the largest gathering of Chinese intelligence agents outside of China?
Well, the largest concentration, let us say, of intelligence operation. In other words, the biggest operation outside of China.
Yes.
With all of the technology and capability, is probably in Mexico. Probably on the outskirts of Mexico City.
And we obviously know at whom and at what those intelligence activities are aimed, if they're in Mexico.
And remember, the Soviet Union maintained its largest KGB operation in the world in Mexico, because Mexico was very friendly to the Soviets. I mean, these are old issues. Venezuela, Cuba and Mexico were always pro-communist. They supported the communists in the Spanish Civil War. They supported the Soviets and the communists during the Second World War. They supported them ever since, off and on. So the bottom line is this is why this business about the balloon is so depressing. You know, the balloon is not large enough to carry a serious payload that can communicate anything or collect anything. It's somebody said, well, it's the size of 3 school buses. It has to be the size of the Goodyear blimp before you're going to put anything on it that makes any difference. And in the meantime, the Chinese have 300 satellites circling the globe. A third of those have military capability. And several of them constitute China's global positioning system that guides all the missiles and rockets and munitions that they have to their targets.
Do you think
every day, the Chinese satellite constellation monitors where every surface warfare ship in the United States Navy is located? That location information can be rapidly transformed into targeting data.
Mm.
I mean, this is serious. We need to know about it. They don't need a balloon. They have plenty of satellites that will read the names on gravestones in Arlington.
I mean, it's almost
they can monitor every conversation they want, including the one between you and me and Jill and Joe Biden.
I mean, they caused 90% of the country to be fixated on a balloon for 4 days. And rumors spread that Joe Biden said, shoot it down, and the military overruled him, which I can't imagine happening. I think they hesitated to shoot it down because it was overpopulated areas. Do you think that this balloon was a diversion while something else was happening? Or do you think that the balloon was used by the administration to begin laying the groundwork for hatred of China because Joe wants a war with China over Taiwan?
Well, I think the person that's done the best job of answering this question is Matt Taibbi. He published an article it's called Government by Panic. And I think this Biden administration decided to capitalize. That means that if we get 2 weeks of continuous freezing, there is no reason why, at least for meteorological reasons, the Russians should not launch their coming offensive. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, Bakhmut has figured prominently in everybody's calculus because it's drawn so much attention. Bakhmut has turned into something that is analogous in some ways to Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad for Zelensky. Zelensky and his friends seem to think that the loss of Bakhmut is unacceptable, would break the will of the Ukrainian people, demoralize Ukrainian forces. And so he's continued to sacrifice thousands of Ukrainian lives in that place. We now estimate 450,000 casualties thus far in the war, close to 150,000 dead.
Ooh.
And
this is both sides, 450 and 150?
No, this is the Ukrainian side.
Oh.
And if you listen to General Zaluzhny, he came on earlier today, or it could have been last night, talked about how supposedly the Russians are advancing over the bodies of their dead comrades because the Ukrainians have killed so many. The only thing I can think of is that he's channeling Baghdad Bob. If you remember when we intervened in Iraq in 2003, you had this Baghdad Bob kept coming on telling everybody about the victorious forces of Saddam Hussein throwing us back, inflicting casualties.
I remember Baghdad Bob. I tried to interview him, but he turned it down. Turned down everybody from Fox, understandably. But I'm interested in your comparison of General Zaluzhny to Baghdad Bob, of all people. I thought General Zaluzhny was the adult and was credible, not only to the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian public, but to the Russian high command.
Well, I'm not sure about the last part of you're credible to the Russians. I just don't know what they think. I doubt seriously that they hold anybody in the current regime in high esteem. Having said that, remember that Zaluzhny was actually very honest to the extent that he could be in his Economist interview, and essentially pointed out, I need a new army. I need all of this equipment. If I don't get it, I'm probably not going to be able to withstand what's coming from the Russians. But now he's back in the saddle, and he's been told to get back online and back on board. And the mantra is, we're killing Russians, by the hundreds every day. We're winning. We're doing well. But you know, as well as I do, they're now pressing teenagers into service. We have photos of them and video coming out over various internet sites, which is tragic to say the least. 16-year-old boys.
It's not only tragic, and as you pointed out to me in some private emailing you and I did, where are the NGOs? Where are the non-government organizations that are humanitarian to prevent this? And it's probably, I don't know how old these kids were. The kids that I saw, their faces looked 14, 15, 16. It was hard to tell because they had military gear on, but they didn't shave yet. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's got to be a violation of international law and clearly European human rights, which is pretty sensitive on the use of children in the military. But beyond that, is it not telling of how desperate Zelensky is?
Well,
if he's conscripting 15 and 16-year-olds?
Of course, but to this, you've also got to add the fact that they are desperately seeking foreign fighters now. The foreign fighters are becoming very, very important to them because they just don't have experienced NCOs and officers anymore. They're bringing in raw talent with very little training. And of course, you have this man, Milburn, the retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, who came out and gave an interview and talked about how desperate the Ukrainians were. And he talked about the heavy losses and frankly, why he was pulling out his mercenary training group. So I think at this point in time, it's really up to the Russians. The initiative is passed to them. The weather is in their favor now, and there's nothing to stop them from attacking whenever they want to by the middle of January.
What is the status of the 300,000 or so, more or less, reservists called up to duty back in the fall, trained, armed, transported, ready to go? I'm assuming trained, armed, transported, and ready to go. I'll leave that to you to correct me.
No, I think so. Understand that I do disagree a little bit with some other analysts. Scott Ritter has argued it's going to take longer to get them ready. I think they're integrated now. As I said, they're getting the 2 weeks of freezing temperatures. Okay. There is no reason why they cannot attack. And everything that's been happening down in the Donbass, everything that happens with these missile strikes that go in day after day, is all about shaping the battle space, making it safe, if you will, for the maximum offensive power of the Russian army.
All right. In the interest of fairness, and because this is television, and because I like, or it's streaming, because I like to stir the pot, we from time to time have others on than you and Scott Ritter, even though you and Scott are
you have other people on? I'm shocked, Judge.
Are our favorites. This is a person, longtime friend of mine, longtime CIA guy that our audience loves to hate. And I asked him, Jack Devine, about the 300,000 Russians. It's a long answer, but he gets around to answering it at the end. Gary, doesn't he have about 300,000 called up, uniformed, now trained reservists about to enter the theater of war? And if he does, wouldn't that overwhelm the Ukrainian forces?
He had 180,000 in the last round. I mean, that's not chicken feed, right? And you looked at it. They weren't armed properly. Where did they get the new arms? Where did they get the training? How did they get so battle ready in 6 months? You're looking at Ukrainians have been fighting for almost a year now. They're as tough as nails. Their strategy, their planning. You're going to send a lot of rookies in. Do they have gas? They have logistics? 300,000. They're going to just march in. They're going to use air power. I mean, do they want to fight? We know what wars are like when people they went into Afghanistan. My goodness. I mean, full-blown Russian army went in and was driven off by sheep herders. And why? Because and I'll tell you firsthand, the Russian soldiers did not want to fight in Afghanistan. Are they really going to fight in Ukraine? I mean, it's like you're almost like a civil war, and it's unprovoked. We'll see look at the Iraqi army. How many troops are in the Iraqi army, Judge? 300,000 armed by the United States. Where did they go? They went home. So size isn't the story.
All right, Colonel, I saw you chuckling on the monitor. What do you think?
Well, I don't
Jack
know.
is always going to mouth the party line. I don't know. Maybe
Right.
this would be against the law. Maybe they clip the pensions of CIA officers who've retired and failed to mouth the company line. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't see this man as someone who knows much about Russians or Ukrainians. His comments about Afghanistan are really very misleading. The Russian, if we go back and look at the Soviet forces that went into Afghanistan at the beginning, they were overwhelmingly Russians. They went in there and they very rapidly established themselves. Then the subsequent follow-on forces were overwhelmingly reservists that came out of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. In other words, nearby places. And frankly, these people weren't terribly interested in fighting what was there. But having said all of that, our so-called Iraqi army vanished almost overnight, whereas the Soviet-trained forces held forth for a couple of years after they left, and so did its government.
Does he have a point when he says the 300,000 don't have the will to fight? Or
No.
are these 300,000? I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about like National Guard guys who have jobs during the week and they train 1 weekend a month and two weeks a summer like here? Or are we talking about hardened professionals?
Well, first of all, unlike most of your National Guardsmen in the United States, all of these 300,000 have served inside the Russian army.
They have been on active duty.
Yeah. And anywheres from 3 to 8 years. And so what they've been going through is essentially updating their training, updating them on the various modernization programs, the equipment that's available. And they've been training for winter fighting. And they've been training very, very hard. The other thing is, I don't think this man really understands anything about Russians or Ukrainians. First of all, we all know Ukrainians are tough. I grew up with them, and I know their war record. They've always been very, very fine soldiers. That's not open to debate. But it doesn't matter how good you are when you're up against overwhelming firepower and you take enormous losses, which is what's happened. On the Russian side, anybody who thinks the Russians are weak is crazy. In fact, I would say these 300,000 are not only enthusiastic about going to Ukraine, I think they have enormous backing at home inside Russia. All the words on the atrocities committed by Ukrainian forces against Russian troops have filtered out to the population, despite the fact that the Putin government has tried to clamp down on it and suppress it, largely because they're afraid of what this anger could produce in Russia against Ukraine. I totally disagree with his entire assessment.
Okay. In the midst of all of this, President Emmanuel Macron of France has weighed in. Here's what he said. I think it was on New Year's Eve. France will continue to help Ukraine, quote, without fail, and, quote, until victory itself. We will build a just and durable peace together. Count on France and count on Europe. Is he talking about troops? What is he talking about, as you understand this? Or is this just political pabulum for the French press?
I think it's a combination of all the above. He's also made comments about finding a way forward that's not going to involve compelling Russia to give up all of its gains. He's already said publicly, we can't expect the Russians to give up Crimea. And he said we should have pressed ahead in the Minsk agreements and done a better job with Luhansk and Donetsk and so forth. I think it depends on which audience he's talking to and when you hear him.
All right. Here's General Stoltenberg, the commander of NATO. I call on allies to do more. It is in all our security interests to make sure Ukraine prevails and Russian President Vladimir Putin, he mentions him by name, does not win. This is pretty direct and in your face, Secretary General of NATO to President of Russia, isn't it, Colonel?
Well, let's stop and think about what he's just said. How many times did you hear FDR or any of the leading lights in the U.S. military or the government during World War II complain about the failure of the British or the Soviets to do enough? This is a trick question.
Yeah.
Never. All right?
Right.
That's nonsense. We never made those kinds of comments because they were in the fight long before we were, and they were heavily engaged. We were giving them everything we could to keep them engaged until we could bring force to bear against them. My point is, if this were a successful operation, a successful war effort, you wouldn't be begging your allies to do more. The truth of the matter is that Europeans overwhelmingly want nothing to do with this war, and their governments know it.
Is there military significance to what Secretary General Stoltenberg said? Does he command troops? Can he order troops in?
Stoltenberg is a mouthpiece for whomever governs Washington, for whomever is president of the United States, whatever the administration is. He says and does what Washington tells him to. And he can snap his fingers, he can crack his whip, but you can't create armies and forces out of nothing. It takes a long time to put people into organizations, into formations, train them, equip them. This is not something you do quickly. Frankly speaking, that's why we've been waiting for several months now, watching the Ukrainians impale themselves on Russian defenses, because the Russians are doing exactly that. They're getting ready all of these massive military formations to attack. So what if we start going down the list? And the French army is designed to conduct safaris in North Africa. The British army is smaller and less capable. You know, the United States Marine Corps is larger and better equipped and better organized to fight than most of the European forces. The Poles are now bringing up, we think, 200,000 men. I'm told they've already got 90,000 mobilized, and they're trying to get them ready so that they can build their army up, presumably to defend Poland, but I worry about other things, as we know.
Well, General, I am very concerned about Poland. You and I have discussed this. You know this better than almost anybody. There's 90,000 Poles on active duty. There's 40,000 Americans intermingling and training with them. They are just they are just west of the Poland-Ukraine border. Now you tell me that this crazy president of Poland, who thinks that somehow Crimea is going to go back to Ukraine when this is over, is about to add 250,000 more troops.
Oh, absolutely.
That's where the hair trigger could occur, in my view, that would start World War III. What do you think?
Well, here's the other thing. The Poles see themselves as a great nation that has been deprived of its opportunity to be great. They were great 400 years ago. They were powerful in Europe, the largest state in Europe, the most powerful military force in Europe 400, 500 years ago. They would really like to be that again. And so when you listen carefully to the Poles and you watch their television, they're talking about expanding Poland to regain control of territories they once governed. That's not necessarily a NATO objective. And I don't think that the majority of NATO partners are going to stand by and say, oh, yes, charge forward. Let's support the annexation of Western Ukraine. And by the way, Minsk used to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Oh, that would be insane. That would be insane.
Of course. So the Poles are not playing with a full deck in strategic terms right now. And we're doing nothing to rein them in. On the contrary, we're encouraging them.
Recently, the Ukrainians, using either missiles or drones, attacked a building where Russian troops were housed. Adjacent to the building, I think stupidly and foolishly, but I'm not the military guy. I'm just a simple lawyer. Adjacent to the building where the Russians had stored munitions, it appears that the munitions exploded. Close to 100 Russians were killed. And now it appears that the Ukrainian missiles, American missiles, were able to zero in somehow because they knew that Russian troops were there because they were using their cell phones. Can you explain this?
6 HIMARS missiles were fired, or rockets, if you will, were fired at this target. It was a company-sized element, almost 200 men. 4 of those missiles or rockets were shot down. 2 went in and blasted the area and caused at least 89 deaths, as the Russians are now reporting them, another 100 casualties. The Ukrainians, of course, this is a piece of absolutely not, Judge. And
now, if I were to put that question to General David Petraeus, how do you think he might answer that in light of his public comments in the last week?
Well, I suppose you'd have to call all the people that helped to promote him, who are currently sitting in positions of authority in Washington, before he gave you an answer, to ensure that whatever he said was what they wanted him to say.
Okay, and you're not
one of the things I think you and your audience can appreciate is this. In 1942, after the fall of Tobruk, June, July timeframe of 1942, the British had been through 2 years, 2 long years of uninterrupted defeats at the hands of the Germans. And remember, in almost every encounter, the British and their allies outnumbered the Germans. And finally, after Tobruk fell, which was a very major blow in North Africa, someone asked Churchill, well, are we losing this war? We haven't won any battles. He said, I know battles are important, but battles don't necessarily decide wars. He said, in modern warfare, it's the trends in the wars that decide them. And the trends ultimately favor us, not the Germans. Be patient. Well, I think Churchill was right. The Russians have not sustained any serious defeats. And we know that they were off to a slow start for all the reasons that we've covered. Where they are right now is, frankly, where they want to be. They are defending the territory that they've annexed, and they are training, preparing, and organizing for the major offensives to come in November and December. And here's something else that your audience may find of interest. The 300,000 man mobilization is over, in the sense that those 300,000 reservists are now inside the Russian armed forces, and they're integrated and they're being prepped, trained, whatever you want to call it. But the mobilization has not been suspended. And there's a lot of evidence that decisions behind the scenes have been made to continue mobilizing, so that instead of looking at 700,000 troops, Russian troops in November, December timeframe, we may be looking at 1 million in the field before January. And I think this is because Mr. Putin and his national security advisors, his military commanders, are listening to us and the threats that we continue to make, and the insistence that he effectively surrender to Mr. Zelensky. And that's not going to happen.
Among those threats, and the reason, of course, for my reference to General David Petraeus in an earlier question, is, of course, a public comment that General Petraeus made, in which he said the United States and some NATO countries should lead some sort of an allied force, not a NATO force, but some sort of a coalition of the willing, to quote George W. Bush, on the ground in Ukraine against the Russians. And knowing Petraeus, as I know you do, I'm sure you know that he wouldn't have said something like that without having run it up the flagpole first. So first, what do you think militarily of what General Petraeus has offered? And secondly, who, since he's a civilian now, up the flagpole, would he have run this past? Who else wants this? Does the Secretary of State actually expect his boss, the President of the United States, whose administration is tottering on the brink and whose physical existence is tottering on the brink, to put American troops on the ground? I'm asking you a lot all at once. I'll let you take those balls and run with them.
Well, on the first question, I think we have to regard this as having been a kind of trial balloon. In other words, Petraeus was given this material and told to run with it because the people in Washington are interested to see or hear what kind of a response, if any, they get from the American people. That's the first thing. Secondly, unfortunately, I do think there is serious planning going on about the use of U.S. forces in Ukraine. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's ill-conceived, but it's going on. Third, the mention of a coalition of the willing is a dead giveaway, because NATO is not united on this issue. Most people in Europe are not interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. So when you ask the question, what is this coalition of the willing? Well, are we going to get some Romanian troops, Polish troops, perhaps, maybe some Lithuanians? It's hard to tell. Anybody else prepared to show up? I don't know how many British troops they can expect to get. I don't think the British could field 10 to 15,000 troops in any period of time that would be competent on the battlefield. The French, they're already overextended in Africa. So I don't know who else we're talking about. So this coalition of the willing, as it's termed, is another indicator. And then finally, why are we talking about this at all, Judge?
Right. Why? Because the globalists in the State Department want to put Putin out of business, and they think they can do it.
First, it's because Ukraine is devastated. It's losing. It's on the brink of extinction. The counterattacks that we saw over the last several months, it started out with 30, 40, 50,000 troops, then declined to perhaps 10,000, 12,000. They declined further to 3,000 to 5,000. And recently we've seen battalion-sized units, 500, 600, 700, actually trying to probe and walk through Russian defenses. They're running out of manpower that can fight. And in fact, the information I have is that the Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, and we don't know how many there are. I've heard lots of estimates all the way up to and a little bit above 10,000. And then the so-called Foreign Legion that Ukraine has fielded, which may number 5,000 to 7,000 or less. Again, we don't know. That those formations are the only formations with any stomach for a serious attack in a major fight. So that's the other point. Now, finally, to go to yours, yes, Judge, we have people in Washington who want a direct confrontation with Russia because they believe they can bully Russia. They believe they can compel the Russians to submit, that Mr. Zelensky can show up and accept their surrender. It's bizarre. There's no evidence for it. It's dangerous. It's stupid. But yes, they are there. And I think that characterizes the thinking at the top of the administration.
So Zelensky, who was all over the place in the media for 7 or 8 months, really hasn't made, two observations, hasn't made very many public appearances in the past month. So I offer to you the thought that maybe he knows that what you're saying is truthful and his days are numbered. The other observation I want to make is the storied American 101st Airborne is in Europe for the first time since World War II. They're in Romania. What are they doing in Romania?
Well, according to the reports, there are about 5,000 of them. This is a mix of light infantry and UH-60 aircraft. I don't know if they have a battalion of H-64D attack helicopters with them, but they're supposedly working with Romanian forces. Again, this looks like one wing or one leg of the coalition of the willing. Then the rest of the division is up in Poland, which is several hundred miles north. And there are all sorts of rumors on the internet, and people are saying, oh, well, they're going to fly in to Odessa and set up a blocking position to prevent the Russians from moving on Odessa. And they'll be reinforced. Okay, I find it hard to believe that we would be quite that stupid, because Odessa is very definitely on the menu for the Russians. It's a Russian city, a Russian-speaking city. It's never been Ukrainian. And they are going to retake it, just as they're going to retake Kharkov for the same reasons. And that's probably where they would stop normally. But if this happens, I don't think the outcome will be a positive one for the United States and its coalition of the willing. And then, of course, the question is, if we sustain heavy casualties and we are seen as losing, are we then going to turn to nuclear weapons? Because as I've said repeatedly on this thing, I have never seen any interest on the Russian side in the use of a nuclear weapon. I've seen nothing to indicate it. The statements that have been made were always made in response to us, response to anyone who questioned whether the Russians would respond if they were attacked with a nuclear weapon. And they made it very clear that they will. And this is the problem with this limited nuclear war business. But I think now the danger is we could walk into this. And as I tried to point out in that short 1,000-word op-ed, we're not ready. This is sort of get set and go in whether you're ready or not. And we're not ready. The infrastructure isn't there. The tons of ammunition are not on hand. The force sizes don't make any sense. I mean, we keep saying, well, the Russians were stupid when they went in, they made all these mistakes. Well, the Russians at least went in there with a goal of not killing fellow Orthodox Slavs. That was a goal. Didn't want to kill them. All right, that didn't quite work out as they'd hoped. But now we're talking about going in, and we have no such guidelines or constraints, but we don't have the forces. And we're now saying, well, the Russians are building forces. Well, there's a reason for that. This place is the size of Texas. If you don't have several 100,000 troops, you're not going to be able to dominate it. How are we going to do this? I think it's insane.
Something else that you alluded to in your fascinating 1,000-word op-ed to which you just made reference was the War Powers Resolution. In my view, a profoundly unconstitutional piece of legislation, but it's never been tested in the courts. And it means that we could all wake up some morning to find Joe Biden on television saying, by the way, last night, 50,000 American troops entered the fray in the Ukraine war, and there's nothing the Congress or anybody could do about it for 90 days. Then he reports on it, and they can stay another 90 days. Then he needs congressional approval. But for half a year, for 180 days, he has, in my view, the constitutional power that Madison and company expressly reserved for the Congress in his own hands. He can choose the target and wage the war, which makes him a prince. Madison was adamant about separating war-making power from war-waging power, but this terrible piece of legislation, which President Nixon vetoed because he thought it crimped his style rather than expanding his power, another argument for another time, gives Joe Biden that authority. Is this something we have to fear, that we wake up some morning and find out that while we all slept, 50,000 uniformed American troops, I'm just throwing that number out, entered the Ukraine-Russian war?
Yes. I think it's a real possibility now, much more so than any kind of nuclear exchange. I still do not believe that anyone in the White House is deranged enough to even consider such a thing. But I do think that this is a possibility. How much is it? 90%, 80%, 60%? I don't know. But I do know that after I'd written that op-ed piece, I received an awful lot of information from people on the inside telling me that I was dead right and on target, and then beginning to tell me the kinds of things that were under consideration. So yes, I think it's a possibility. Now, if we go back to this whole business, let's face it, certainly since FDR, I think we've lived in a world of presidential government. And that's one of the tragedies of the United States. We were founded as
Agreed. There's no question about that the presidency, no matter who occupies it, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, or Harry Truman or Barack Obama, the presidency has expanded almost to the point of dictatorial powers. That George W. Bush and his successors all claim that somehow they can kill people. I mean, these are claims that even to FDR would have sounded alien. But I have heard nothing other than from you and our colleagues who've been critical of General Petraeus from his statement. Now, you say it may have been a trial balloon. Were they expecting tub thumping in support of it? Or were they expecting silence because no one wants to be the first one behind Petraeus to say it's time to put American troops in harm's way?
I think they're most interested to see if there is any public reaction. The people that govern in Washington are really accustomed to a quiescent, compliant public. I mean, how often do people take to the streets to object to things that we do overseas with the American military? The last time I remember any serious opposition to anything being done overseas was during the Vietnam War. And people say, well, see, that's because we had a draft. Not really. It took years before they finally went to the streets and objected to the Vietnam War. How long were we in Vietnam before anything happened? 3 years. Right. So the problem is that most Americans on any given day aren't interested. And so what you get as a consequence of this is what you have now. Right now, we have people at the top of this administration who are behaving like 3-year-old children who have found out that there are these things called electrical sockets, and they've got forks, and they're shoving forks into the electrical socket to see what happens. Well, one of them is going to be electrocuted, to be sure. Probably will be shocked by it at the least. That's where we are. That's what this idea of going into Ukraine is. It's dangerously stupid. You are pushing the fork into the electrical outlet.
Let's get back to the status of things on the ground. One of our viewers asks, isn't it true that Russia has lost territory? And if so, why? That is, lost territory that it had previously conquered and acquired.
Well, the only place that they have lost territory, as I understand it, that is significant in terms of square mileage was up near Kharkov. And that was an area where they only had 2,000